do bear with us in case we have any technical issues. If you do have questions, like you saw for the keynote session, if you have questions, please make sure that you are putting those into the chat, and I will monitor those. And after our presenters finish, I'll read the questions and give our folks a chance to answer those questions. If you decide that this session is not for you, that's okay. You can go back to the conference landing page and go to a different session. And don't forget also that we'd like you to engage with us on social media. And so if you would like to do that, you can do that using the hashtag that you see popping up in the chat, CODA 2021. And now I have the pleasure of introducing our session presenters for this session, Erik Anderson and Sam Bezjak. Erik Anderson is the Director of College and Career Readiness within the Office of Post-Secondary Policy, and Sam Bezjak is a Research Analyst for the Office of Post-Secondary Policy. Erik earned his undergraduate degree in anthropology from Brigham Young University and his master's in anthropology and education from Columbia University. Before joining MDHEWD in 2014, Erik taught middle school in rural Mississippi with Teach for America and worked for the Office of Disability Services at Columbia University. Sam graduated from the University of Missouri in 2018 and joined the Missouri Department of Higher Education and Workforce Development shortly afterwards. Since then, he has been with the department for a little over 2 years. The research done by the College and Career Readiness Unit spans multiple policy areas concerning higher education and its relationship to the workforce, such as dual credit, remedial education reform, and equity in higher education at a statewide level. So please join me in welcoming Erik and Sam, and I will turn it over to you.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me? Perfect. We're having a snow day today, so all my children are at home. So it may get a little bit loud. They may suck up our internet connectivity, but we'll manage to get through somehow. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, and Sam and I will go ahead and get started. Can everybody see that? Can you give me a thumbs up if you can see that? Perfect. Well, welcome so much to our session today. We know there were a lot of good sessions, and we appreciate you being here. Sam and I are going to talk about the demographic profile of the modern transfer student and how it relates to equity in our as Dr. Jones mentioned, Sam and I are with the Office of Post-Secondary Policy. We work in the College and Career Readiness Unit, for the department. A lot of our work is on college and career readiness that transition from high school into college. But we've been working very closely with our state equity initiatives and writing lots of reports and white papers and things of that nature. And so this fit in with what we were doing last year in equity work, and we decided to pick it up and share information with you. Again, but we want our equity approach and what it is that we're doing here at the state, and we're operating. So we started our work in equity, I think from the beginning. Every initiative we've undertaken, everything we've done at the state in terms of higher education, we tried to look at it through an equity lens. How practices impacting students and are there adverse effects for certain subpopulations? Our approach to this was what the Racial Equity Institute calls the groundwater metaphor. right? If you're walking along the bank of a river, or you're walking along a stream or a lake, and you see, a dead fish in the water, you may think, well, maybe that fish was old, maybe it was weak, maybe a predator got it. Who knows? And you wouldn't think much of it. But if you're walking along and you suddenly see lots of dead fish, right? It suddenly isn't a question of maybe just one or two fish suddenly dying. Maybe there's an issue with the groundwater. And the approach that we've taken with our equity work is we want to look at the groundwater, right? We want to look at the data. We want to see what we can find, and we want to see if there are issues. And if there are systemic issues, the data are going to show us that. If it's one or two instances of underperformance, then it may just be on the individual. But if there are larger patterns, we think it may be the groundwater. So that's the approach that we've taken. What is the groundwater showing us, and what are the gaps? So it's important to start with a definition of equity. What is equity? And this has really driven the work that we've done thus far. Equity is the idea that a student's life circumstances should not dictate chances of success. It is often measured by observing areas where it does not exist, the gaps among learners from varying geographies, between genders, races, or ethnicities, and by income level. These differences in outcomes are known as opportunity gaps. So what we've done is we've looked at the data. We divide it up into these key demographic areas, as we mentioned here. We look at age, we look at gender, we look at race, ethnicity, we look at income levels, we look at geography, we look at parental education levels. There are a lot of different graphics out there depicting the difference between equality and equity. All of them are interesting. None of them are perfect. You could poke holes in every one, but this is one that I like especially, right? Equity or equality, everyone getting the same thing. So in the top picture, you see everyone has the same sized bike. And it doesn't work well for everybody. Equity is giving individuals what they need, right? And in our viewpoint, it's meeting students where they're at and giving them what they need. I used to teach middle school ELA, and I remember, I would have to spend some time with more students than others, and a lot of times they'd say, well, that's not fair. You're not spending equal time with everybody. And I'd have to stop and explain about equity and how sometimes being fair isn't always being equal. And it's a hard lesson to learn. As I mentioned earlier, the metrics that we've analyzed are age, race and ethnicity, sex, income levels, parental education levels, and geographic origin. For the purpose of our data, we looked at county designation, which is the Missouri Economic Research Information Center, and the Department of Health and Senior Services uses. And there are 14 urban counties that they've identified in the state that are based on population density. Those are Boone, Buchanan, Cass, Clay, Cole, Greene, Jackson, Jasper, Jefferson, Newton, Platte, St. Charles, St. Louis, and St. Louis City. We realize that this is a very broad brushstroke. We know that while Columbia would be considered an urban area, there are a lot of areas outside of Columbia and Boone County that may not be considered urban. But the level of data that we're working with here, we have to make some broad brushstrokes. So just be aware of that. One thing I do want to point out here, the data that we're looking at, they tell us a lot about trends, but they don't tell us much about the students themselves. As Dr. Archambault mentioned, students do a lot of things, and we don't have the meaning behind that. There may be students who start at a community college that never have any intent to transfer, and we don't know that looking at the data. We can't tell which students were wanting to transfer, which weren't. Look at are the trends in the pattern. Also, I want to point out that we are not experts on transfer or transfer policies or knowing what's happening in every institution. What we do know is what the data are telling us and what's happening at the state in terms of our statewide policies. So what we'll do today is we'll share some data with you guys from a national and from the state level. And really what we're hoping that you'll get out of this presentation is that you'll think through the data, you'll engage in some introspection and think, okay, what's going on at our institution? What does the data look like at our institution? and how might we develop some policies that are more inclusive and serve students equitably. And with that, I will pass it over to my colleague, Sam.
Thanks for the introduction to this session, Eric. So moving on from the broad overview to what the national context says about the data regarding transfer, we're going to open the section up by addressing a report from the National Student Clearinghouse Research Center, who put out a report in 2018 based on a 2011 cohort that tried its best to measure the profile of transfer students. From two-year institutions, the report found that Asian and white students were more likely to transfer into four-year institutions at rates of 49.8 and 50.4% respectively than their Black and Hispanic peers at 33.2 and 39.5% respectively. The overall transfer rate, regardless of destination, was 37.1%. And out of this group, only 5.6% of those students transferred after earning a degree from their starting institution. Destination was not disaggregated by sector there. And when isolating transfers specifically from two-year to four-year institutions, only 30% were able to do so successfully. And that bullet point about the 5.6% transferring after earning a degree from their starting institution will be important to keep in mind for the next slide, which also comes from that National Student Clearinghouse report. It's not showing the slide on my screen, Eric. All right, there we go. Sorry about that, folks. So we see that for students of this population that are able to make that transfer successfully from the two-year to the four-year institutions, they're able to get bachelor's degrees at fairly high levels. Once they get their foot in the door, they're fairly successful, and that success is increased, as you can see from the middle set of columns, if they are coming into the destination post-secondary institution with that associate's degree. However, as the next slide will show data from the Community College Research Center, that slice of students is an overall rather small percentage of the overall transfer pie. We can see here that out of the 758,000 degree-seeking community college entrants that were analyzed in this report, 80% of them intended to earn a bachelor's degree, but only 16.7% ended up earning that bachelor's degree within 6 years. The following slide will show a bit of a demographic breakdown. This is from a different National Student Clearinghouse report, the Tracking Transfer Report, that disaggregated the community college cohort bachelor completion rates by various student level characteristics. And as we can see from the data here, that it's more likely that higher income students are going to be able to do this successfully than lower income students, and there appears to be an advantage to exclusively full-time students over those that are either exclusively part-time or mixed enrollment. And the picture becomes even further complicated when we look at the state of transferring credits, as we'll see on the next slide. A recent report from the Government Accountability Office found on average 13 credit hours are lost in the transfer process from two-year to four-year institutions. For many students, that's over an entire semester. Full-time load is classified as 12 credit hours. Additionally, a report from the American Educational Research Association found further issues for students transferring from two-year to four-year institutions, namely that 1 in 10 students transferring from two-year to four-year institutions lost almost all of their credits on transfer. That's huge. Only 58% of the respondents for that report reported 90% or more of their credits transferring successfully, which has a pretty substantial effect on their likelihood to complete a bachelor's degree. Students who are able to get all or almost all, so 90% or more of their credits transferred, were 2.5 times more likely to complete their bachelor's degree. And even for students that were only able to get between 89% of their credits, they were still 74% more likely to complete a bachelor's degree. And of course, any conversation during this, I know we all hate the phrase trying time, but it fits, wouldn't be complete if we didn't discuss the impact that COVID-19 has had on the overall transfer picture, as we'll see on the next slide, that it has complicated things even more. A different report, also from the Community College Research Center, collected data from 100,000 US households using Census Bureau data to analyze student behavior during the pandemic. And it found that 40% of households that reported having a community college student within the household was canceling their plan to continue their enrollment in community college, and an additional 15% reported taking fewer courses or switching programs. And this is not a drop that was seen to the same degree in institutions. As households reporting having a student at four-year universities only report having 20% reduction for those students. And with that, I'm going to hand it back over to Erik so that we can talk more about what this means specifically for the Missouri context.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Sam. You know, as we talked about national data, oh, Sam, it's been brought to my attention that nobody can see you. So you don't mind turning on your camera. As we're talking about the different data aspects, I want to talk about how we got our data. So the data that we used are our Enhanced Missouri Student Achievement Study data, or MSAS, and it's essentially student record level data that we receive from the public institutions and some of the private institutions. For the sake of this presentation, we focused only on the public institutions, mostly because we have a more complete data set for those students. We also have a partnership with the National Student Clearinghouse, so we can send them data on transfer students and see from where they transferred, or after they've completed, or after they haven't shown up in our records for a while, we can see where they've gone. I also appreciate what Dr. Archambault said in her keynote session, that this transfer isn't just about the transfer of credits, right? It's about the student. And when we've talked about transfer and we've talked about statewide policies, the one thing that's always come to our mind is, you know, we understand that policies can be very bureaucratic. We understand that from the state level and an institutional level, but really we need to be doing what's in the best interest of the students. So with that in mind, let's dive into the statewide transfer pattern. We know that the total transfer is decreasing. Again, for a point of clarity, we're looking at data from 2008 to 2018. This does not include more recent data or any impacts of COVID-19. So this is going to be prior to COVID-19. As we saw at the keynote session, and as Sam mentioned too, COVID-19 has definitely impacted transfer practices, but this is prior to it. So we've seen an overall decline in students who transfer. We see the same kind of pattern in enrollments, right? Enrollments kind of peaked in 2011. A lot of the enrollment patterns were brought on by the Great Recession in 2008, 2009. We had a lot of people going back to school, and then a lot of those students were transferring. But since that peak in 2011, enrollment and transfer rates have gone down. What we do see from our data is that the demographic profile of transfer students matches closely to enrollment and state population. So we dove into, back in 2019, when we wrote our first equity report in higher education in Missouri, we looked at the state demographic profile from the ACS, and we matched it with our enrollment file to see if the demographic patterns matched, to see if there was parity. And there is general parity, right? If you look at who's coming in the door, it matches pretty closely the population of the state. What we see an interesting anomaly, though, in our data is that students who transfer students are more likely to identify as some other race. When we look at the overall enrollment data and we look at more statewide transfer data, there's more delineation in terms of race and ethnicity, but transfer students overall, especially from out of state, are more likely to identify as some other race. Transfer students from out of state are actually also less likely to complete the FAFSA, and that's where we get a lot of our data, like income levels, parental education levels, and things like that. So we have incomplete data for our out-of-state transfer students with that. And like enrollments, women outnumber men by 10 to 15 percentage points. We see women enrolling in higher education at a much higher rate, and we see them transferring at a much higher rate than their male counterpart. When we look down, when we do a breakdown in trend data of transferring institution, we can see in and out of state transfer, and we can see in-state transfer by sector. One thing I want to point out is that while overall transfer is declining, as you can see from both the graphs, our out-of-state students are now fewer than our in-state transfer by the public two-year institutions. So it used to be that we had a larger number of students coming from out of state than were transferring from 2 to 4 year institutions in state, but that has now changed, at least as of 2018. Now more of our in-state 2-year students are transferring to other institutions than are coming from out of state. And this is transferring to any institution within the state of Missouri. It could be a 2-year, it could be a 4-year, it could be 4 to 2, things like that. But a bulk of the in-state transfer is also coming from the public 2-year sector. Out-of-state transfer, we look at our top transfer states. No surprise to perhaps anyone, Kansas and Illinois are in the top 2 states that send students to Missouri. And if you look at the top 5 states, 56.6% of all out-of-state transfers come from those top 5 states. You look at our contiguous states, you know, Missouri has the largest number of neighboring states of any other state in the nation. We've got 60.5% of all of our transfer students coming from out of state from one of those contiguous states, and 5 of those contiguous states are in the top 10 transfer. As I mentioned, they're half as likely to have filled out a FAFSA, so we don't have that information. But we do know of those that did fill out a FAFSA, roughly 1/3 are at or below the poverty level, 1/2 are at or below 20% of poverty, and around 2/3 are Pell eligible. What we're also seeing, interestingly, is about 60% are claimed to be Missouri residents. So these may very well be students who grew up in Missouri, graduated from high school in Missouri, went to an out-of-state institution, maybe they live in Kansas City and they went across the border to Johnson County Community College. Maybe they started out at KU, maybe they started out at University of Illinois, and they decided to come back. It could also be that different institutions have different residency requirements, and after you've lived in a county for so long, you're able to claim that county as your resident and get in-state tuition. We know that's an issue too. And we know that around 28%, there was about a 28% decline from 2008, or a 46% decline from its peak. And older students are more likely to be out of state than in states. When you look at in-state transfer, this is transfer from 2-year public institutions, and again, it's to any other institution. They may be transferring to other public 2 years. They may be transferring to public 4-year institutions. As I mentioned, it's now greater than all of out-of-state transfer. It's increased actually from 53 to 61% from 2008 to 2018. And if you look at the peak, it's not as severe as it was in some of the other ones. It actually kind of levels off between 2011, 2012 before it starts to slightly decline, and then it's leveled off from 2016 to 2018. Overall, there's been about a 12% decline in in-state transfer across all sectors, except for the public 2 years. we see a large decline from four-year publics and a 47.4% decline from four-year independent institutions. Now we're going to focus specifically on kind of that vertical transfer from two-year to four-year institutions. We know that there's a lot of swirl. We've looked at the data, and there's actually quite a number of students who transfer from four-year to two-year institutions. We know there are a lot of reasons for that, but again, the data don't tell us why students are doing that. So to keep things clean and to keep things focused, we're going to talk primarily right now about the 2 to 4 year transfer pipeline. What we have here is a chart of transfer by race over the past 11 years. And what we see is that a bulk of our students who transfer are white. That's no surprise. But what you may not be able to see clearly here is that the proportion of Black students who transfer is well below the state demographic proportion, right? I think of our college-age students, there are roughly 14% of them are Black, but we're seeing transfer only about 9 to 10% in the transfer population. So they're underrepresented in this transfer population. As I mentioned earlier, overall demographic profile of transfer students matched enrollment and statewide profile. Roughly 1 in 5 are at or below the poverty level. 1 in 3 is at or below 200% of the poverty level. Around 98% are Missouri residents. So students who transfer in-state tend to be from in-state. And 1 in 3 are from rural areas, which matches our demographic profile of the state. 28% are first-generation students, and as I mentioned, Black students are underrepresented in this transfer group. Look at students who complete an associate degree at a 2-year institution and then transfer onto a 4-year institution. We also see some interesting trends. It's gone up over the past few years. It's kind of leveled out starting in around 2012 with some slight fluctuations year to year, but it's pretty consistent. We know that around 37% of students who complete an associate degree at a Missouri public 2-year institution transfer to a 4-year institution within 1 year of completing. There's been a 52% increase in the number of completing associate degree, and this includes out-of-state students. So we're able to see once an institution indicates that a student is a transfer student, we're able to send that information to National Student Clearinghouse and find out where that student came from. To keep this in mind, this kind of goes with the trends that the associate degree completion has increased through 2014, but it's since declined. And I saw a question that said, is there a differentiation here between type of associate's degree, whether it's an AAT, AAS, AS, AA? For this, there is no distinction. We understand that the students in like an associates of applied science don't intend to move on. We just want to look at all associate's degrees for this purpose. We also know too that looking at our enrollment files and the trends there, we know that Black students and low-income students are overrepresented in community college enrollment, but they are underrepresented in both associate degree completion and transfer once they've completed the associate degree. So we know there are equity gaps there. This is a breakdown of student transfer by race. As you can see, the gap is widest here in terms of Black students. We looked at gaps for income levels. We looked at gaps at parental education levels, rural and urban students. We looked at gaps by age. And the biggest gap that we see consistently in transfer is that in terms of race, ethnicity. And it's in terms of generally comparing Black students and white students together. We see from the data that they're less likely to transfer than their white, Asian, or Hispanic peers, and this gap is actually increasing over time, right? It's getting wider. Now, what COVID has done to this at this point, I think we have some national data to show, but we don't know what it's doing in Missouri. But my guess is it's going to be even wider than it was in 2018. Unlike other trends with low income, know that they're traditionally more likely to transfer. What we see in other data is that low-income students are more likely to earn a certificate or credential than to go on and earn a 4-year degree. but we're seeing that traditionally they've been more likely to transfer, but that's kind of leveled out in recent years. First generation students are less likely to transfer than their peers, and these gaps are also slightly increasing over time. And rural students are more likely to transfer than their urban peers, but that gap is close. This is a look at transfer cohort graduation rates from 2- to 4-year institutions. We looked at students who had transferred, and then we looked at how many of them had graduated 3 years after transfer. And again, what we're seeing here too is a general uptick. There was a bit of a dip around 2012, 2011 for students, but then we're seeing a general uptick in the number of students who are transferring and then graduating within 3 years at a public 4-year institution. Now, what I think is telling here is if you look at the race ethnicity, again, the gap is the widest between Black and white students, even wider than those between age groups and even wider than those between income levels. If you look at the age group chart, you're actually seeing that that gap is increasing, that older students are less likely to complete. And there may be a number of reasons for that. They may be part-time students. They may have other obligations. Again, we can't know that from the data, but we are seeing that gap that's occurring. The gap between Black students and white students was at its largest in 2012. It's kind of narrowed a bit through 2014, but as of the 2015 cohort, it's widened back out again. And again, you look at the income levels, there's virtually no difference in the 2015 cohort between those at the poverty level and those at or below 200% of the poverty level. Unsurprisingly, those higher income students above 200% of the poverty level are completing at much higher rates. As I mentioned, the large discrepancies are in terms of age, race, and income levels. The gaps seem to be widening in some years. There's virtually no difference among parental education levels. So first generation students are no more or less likely to graduate within 3 years as peers that have one or both parents that have graduated from college. There is no consistent difference between rural and urban students. And as usual in higher education, females are more likely to complete than males. So again, what we're seeing here consistently across the data is that the largest disparities, the largest gaps are in terms of race, ethnicity, then income levels, and then age. The other ones, there are some gaps, but they're not consistent. They're not as large as those three that I just mentioned. So those are areas of further research, and I encourage each of you to look at your own data and see what you're seeing at your campuses. And with that, I want to pass it back over to Sam. We've been in some conversations with the Missouri College Access Network, Francine Pratt, who heads up that group, and we've been talking about using the Common App more. This actually arose from our first Equity Summit that we held in 2019. One of the suggestions that came out of our hackathon groups, which came together to find solutions to the equity gaps that we identified in the enrollment data, was to use the Common App to increase enrollments. And we think that there's a way that we can use this in transfer to help some of these gaps. And with that, I'll pass it off.
Thanks, Eric.
Sam, if you don't mind turning on your video, I've had several people say they'd like to see your smiling face for this presentation.
Unfortunately, my WebEx settings are such that it's a no-go, and I typically have audio issues when I have the video turned on anyway. So for all folks that were wondering, I apologize. It's not because I don't want to be on camera. I just don't want my audio to be cutting in and out all the time. Perks of having less than good internet, but whatever. So that aside, like Eric mentioned, this was a topic that arose from our hackathon discussions from the 2019 Summit on Equity in Higher Education. And the more that we spoke with Francine and our other colleagues at the Missouri College Access Network, as well as speaking to some representatives of the Common App as an organization themselves, we really started to see a lot of potential utility as a transfer tool. So this image comes from a recent report that the Common App put out and some of their data, and we can see as far as Common App usage by county goes, there's a lot of white space here. And most of the counties that have values higher than 1 are in the areas that you would expect there to be more people using it: St. Louis County area, Kansas City area, Boone County, Springfield. So we see this as potentially a untapped resource for a lot of our rural students. And if we move on to the next slide, we'll see just how much popularity the Common App has been generating over time. The number of raw applicants has more than doubled from 2013-14 to 2020 to 2021. So we see that there is a growing awareness, I suppose you could say, of the Common App and its services. And the next slide will show the Common App usage in a national context. And granted, it's a little harder to glean insights from this, but if you just compare us to our peers, our contiguous states, aside from Illinois, we're kind of leading the pack. Only Tennessee really has more registered users, applicants rather, than we do, other than obviously Illinois. And to round out our findings on the Common App, we're just going to be pulling just a few high-level highlights from their 2019-2020 reports that they shared with us in the next slide. There's been a overall 37.4% increase in Common App applicants from 2014-15 to now. Applicants from prospective Black and Latinx students have increased by 67.2% over that time period. And of this population, 31.4% of applicants are first-generation students, and 8.6% of applicants are transfer students. And we think that by possibly getting that 8.6% number higher in the Missouri context, we can really be helping a lot of students as they progress through their academic pipeline.
Yeah, just one final point to add there. We know that more than half of our public four-year institutions are already utilizing the Common App. They're already using it. We know that it's cost prohibitive for community colleges and open enrollment institutions to use it for admissions purposes. But because so many of our public four-years are already using it, and many of our neighboring states are using it as well, we think it's a great tool that two-year institutions can use to help their students as they decide where to transfer. If they want to transfer to more than one institution, it saves them time because they just enter in some generic information and then some very specific stuff for each institution they want to apply to, but it could save them a lot of time and help them when they're applying. Plus, it's only one system to learn as opposed to learning the ins and outs of everyone's transfer websites and application websites. We're more than happy to answer any questions. We know that we've got about 5 minutes, but I think we've got about 20 minutes to the next session. So we're more than happy to stay a little bit longer if there are any questions. And with that, I'll stop sharing my slides so that I can see the questions as they come up.
Yeah, and I can read those to you, to you guys. Thank you so much, Eric and Sam, for a really interesting presentation. There are a few questions in the chat, and let me go back to one that came in fairly early in the chat, and that was about what it means to transfer successfully. So the question was, I'd be curious about how to define transferred successfully. Does that mean apply to their major requirements or transfer in general, or exactly how is that defined?
In reference to one of the national reports from which Sam had pulled data. So Sam, do you remember how they defined successful transfer in that regard?
I think it was just credit hours going from one institution to the next. I don't think it was disaggregated by inmate or anything like that. I think it was simply a raw analysis of, did these credits go from one institution to the next?
Yeah. I know that that's an inherent weakness in the data, especially at the state level. We've started collecting course level data going back to, I believe, 2014. And that includes some transfer data. So if a student transfers from one institution to another, That institution then reports to us what credit came in with them. But what we don't see is how those apply. We don't know if they count as general education, if they count towards the major, if they count as an elective. So an institution can accept it, but we don't know how it is, and successful is such a subjective term. But it is a weakness in the data that we're aware of.
Great. A second question was, are you finding better graduation rates, presumably from four-year institutions, if the student first earns an associate's degree prior to transfer?
That's a good question, and I don't know that we've analyzed that. I know that we've seen that at a national level, that students who transfer with an associate degree are more likely to transfer. I think in terms of within a certain time period, within 3 years, yeah, students with associate degrees are more likely to transfer. But overall, I don't know that that's the case. That's a good avenue for further inquiry. Thank you. You've given us more work to do.
A third question that came in says, I'm curious, for four-year colleges, do you accept the Common App or coalition apps for transfers? This is coming from someone, it sounds like at Webster, we just started using the Common App for transfer students.
Yeah, is anyone from a four-year institution that uses Common App? Would they like to weigh in? I don't have many details about that, but I'd be interested to hear what folks have to say.
So I asked the question, and I was just curious when you were talking about Common App being a potential ability for us to increase transfer numbers from the two-year college level. I know from Webster, we just started accepting the Common App for transfer students, potentially specifically. We've been accepting them for first years for quite some time. And now we're also using the coalition app for transfers. I haven't seen data yet. This is really new for us, but I would think that for other four-year institutions, I was just curious if everyone else is accepting them and how long you've been doing so.
So it looks like SLU accepts the Common App.
Well, I think the reason why I brought up the Common App here, we're wanting to have some more conversations around this to learn more information. So if you all are interested, we can share our email addresses in the chat. I see Francine Pratt is on the call with MOCAN. What we're hoping to do is maybe have some webinars or some virtual meetings around the state to see how we can leverage the Common App and it's as an existing tool. We had thought about developing our own Missouri-specific Common App, but the cost of doing so would be very high. And so we're thinking about, let's leverage this tool that already exists, that a lot of our institutions are already using, public and apparently private institutions, and let's see if we can't leverage that for transfer.
We have another question that came in a second ago here. Do you know if the Missouri Core 42 students are documented separately in transfer data?
The answer is they should be. Whether that's actually happening is a different story. So we do have in the transfer data. So we have our MSAS data, which is the student record level data. All we know is that if a student was a transfer student or not, or if they're first-time student or a continuing student. In the course level data, it will tell us if a course is part of Core 42, if it has that motor designation. And there's supposed to be a separate file too that shows us how many of the students completed the core prior to transfer. And that unfortunately has not been filled out very well. And I think we're only starting to see students completing that, right? Core 42 was developed in 2018. We're just now, I think, starting to see students who have completed the Core 42 moving forward. So we'll have more data coming soon, hopefully.
And another question related to Core 42, is completion of Core 42 coursework a credential in itself?
No, it's not classified as a credential in and of itself. There is a flag that indicates that a student completed the Core 42, and if they do so, then institutions are supposed to accept the core as their general education requirements. The institution should not require the students to take any more general education requirements unless they're required for the major, but it's not a credential in and of itself.
Great. I am not seeing any additional questions in the chat. So let's go ahead and finish up. I just want to thank Erik and Sam for a really engaging and wonderful presentation. I found this amazingly interesting. Thank you to our audience as well for such great questions and participation. One of the things that we want to remind you of is that we have another session coming up, another breakout session coming up at 11 o'clock. So from 11 to 11:45, we have 3 concurrent breakout sessions, and you can access those sessions using the CODA Conference Landing website. And you see the link in the chat provided for you. You can choose from the following sessions, including best practices, how statewide initiatives can strengthen institutions' transfer success, building workforce pipelines with the Bachelor of Applied Science degree, and building connections that transfer. Again, thank you so much to Erik and to Sam for the presentation. As I mentioned at the beginning of this, all presentations have been recorded and they will be posted on the conference landing site and on the MDHEWD website. As a final reminder, there is not a closing session this year, so we invite you to complete the conference evaluation survey that will be emailed to you. So let's go ahead and take a quick break and join the next set of breakout sessions at 11 o'clock. Thanks so much.